Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to American Civil War from the European perspective, and yeah, I mean, I don't know, we're just gonna jump into this. Obviously, I've done reactions to like learning about like American history and American Civil War and stuff, but from the European perspective, I'm not too sure what he's gonna talk about here, but we're gonna see. And yeah, let's jump into this. Hopefully, you're going to enjoy. Links are in the description to my Patreon if you want to see some more of my reactions to many different things like movies, series, all that good stuff. Links are in the description for those interested. But let's jump into this and see a bit about this story.
It is a cold morning in the winter of 1861, and a northern lawyer is enjoying breakfast by the fireplace. He reaches for the morning issue of the New York Times, hoping for news on the conflict with the rebels. All the papers have been fixated on the diplomatic incident last month with the United Kingdom. A ship smuggling rebel ambassadors had been intercepted by the Union. But surely, the situation can't be as serious as the paper suggests. The affair will probably be resolved in the coming days. But as the lawyer begins reading the paper, he is shocked. The front page story is much different today. French troops have apparently crossed the border from Mexico into Texas in support of the Confederacy.
Huh? What?
The war has escalated.
France did what?
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. What you just saw is, of course, not what really happened. The British and French did not intervene in the American Civil War, and in this video, we're going to explain why. Additionally, we'll explore how other European powers responded, and ultimately why the conflict did not cross the Atlantic. Before we look at the European perspective, let's take a moment to thank our sponsor.
Getting his money, you'll love to see it. Securing the bag. Securing the bag.
Even before the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter, foreign powers were watching the secession crisis in the United States very closely. The US in 1861 wasn't the global superpower it is today, but it was integral to the increasingly interconnected economies of the world. In addition, America represented the still uncertain experiment of democracy in the eyes of Europe. If the United States fell apart, it would make a strong case for the instability and danger of democratic reforms. With that being said, direct involvement in the faraway American war was not viable for most states in Europe. Sending men and materiel across the Atlantic was simply impractical for all but the largest empires, and Europe had no shortage of conflicts of its own to deal with. That being said, many countries did get involved indirectly, so let's run through some of them now, before we take a deep dive into the two nations who were closest to intervening. First, we have the shrinking Papal State, ruled by Pope Pius IX.
Papal State?
In 1862, a Confederate ambassador met with the Pope to convince him of the righteousness of the Southern cause. The ambassador came away from the meeting utterly convinced he had won Pius over, despite having to admit neither he nor Confederate President Jefferson Davis was Catholic, and outright refusing the pontiff's suggestion that the Confederacy consent to gradual emancipation of its slaves. The Pope later wrote a letter to Davis, which was enthusiastically mistranslated as a formal recognition of the Confederate States of America as an independent nation, which was soon turned into wartime propaganda.
Oh wow.
The next nation on our list is the Kingdom of Prussia. Several Prussians were sent to fight in or observe the war on both sides, and throughout the Civil War, these Prussian officers were consistently impressed with themselves by comparison to what they saw as disorganized and poorly trained American armies. In particular, Captain Justus Schreiber scoffed at how little formal training both sides had given their officers before the war.
Americana.
Schreiber and other Prussians did take note of the advances in engineering and defensive tactics made during the war, but attributed most of their success to the vastly different terrain and other circumstances unique to North America. While many Prussian-born officers did observe or command in the conflict, the kingdom as a whole was most concerned with unifying Germany, and was not significantly influenced by the Civil War, coming away from their observations more certain than ever of their own superiority. Further west, the dwindling Spanish Empire took the Civil War as an opportunity to reclaim some of its lost American colonies and occupied the Dominican Republic in 1861.
That's kind of what I'm thinking. I feel like a lot of the European countries were probably wanting the US to fall apart because they're seeing all the influence it has in such a short time frame, and they've taken parts that were owned by the countries at certain points, like Spain taking back some of the Caribbean islands and stuff. But yeah, so I feel like most of this is just going to be European countries just trying to make the US fail in any way possible. It's interesting to sort of see that perspective, though.
The Spanish faced resistance almost immediately, and in 1863, full-scale rebellion began. Soon, Spain had lost control of all but the capital of Santo Domingo.
They tried.
And they unsuccessfully fought the rebellion for 2 more years before withdrawing completely. Others sided more firmly with the Union. On the Italian peninsula, the leaders of the mighty empire of San Marino wrote to President Lincoln to show support of his cause and to offer Lincoln citizenship.
Tiny little San Marino is tiny, right? Isn't it just in somewhere in Italy, or is it an island off Italy? I think it's in Italy. It's just a tiny little country, a small little country saying, giving the support. I mean, I'm sure. Would Lincoln have known that San Marino is even a country at this point?
Lincoln gratefully replied, accepting the offer and establishing the first diplomatic relations between the US and San Marino.
Fair enough.
As for the Kingdom of Italy, they were far more concerned with consolidating their new territory. Finally, to the east, the Russian Empire, which saw a strong United States as an important counterweight to the British Empire, vocally supported the Union, but it never extended an offer of military aid.
That's so funny how it's just completely swapped, like it's just completely switched. Anyone Russia sees as a threat at that point, they're against. So they're obviously against the British Empire at this point, and they're like siding with the US. So fascinating how just over the years, and the US became the superpower. Now we've had a rivalry, or whatever you want to call it, for nearly 70, 80 years or so. I'd say like 80 years.
Like the rest of Europe's leaders, the Russians were unwilling to entangle themselves in a bloody faraway conflict on another continent. The only 2 nations that came anywhere close to getting involved were the British and French empires. In both nations, public opinion was largely divided along class lines. The landowners tended to support the wannabe aristocrats of the South, while the middle and working classes tended to support the Union. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but while the public discourse surrounding the conflict was nuanced and varied, it also was almost entirely irrelevant. People hotly debated, and the newspapers printed countless think pieces and exposés, and yet the decisions about whether Europe would intervene in the American Civil War were made by a mere handful of powerful figures. In France, Emperor Napoleon III, the nephew of the far more successful Napoleon Bonaparte, sought to expand the territory and influence of the French Empire around the world. This initially led him to see the American Civil War as an opportunity. Ever since 1823, the American Monroe Doctrine had prevented the European powers from extending their influence into the Western Hemisphere. But with the House now divided against itself, the Americans were once again vulnerable to European exploitation. A mere 8 months after the Civil War broke out, Napoleon invaded the Republic of Mexico. His army swiftly toppled the government and installed an Austrian noble as Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. US officials were outraged about this, but there was nothing they could do as long as the Confederates controlled the Mexican border. Eager to protect his new puppet, Napoleon wanted to recognize the independence of the Confederacy, but Union diplomats made it very clear that recognition of the rebels would lead to all-out war, and France was unwilling to take the risk. Without allies, and with the growing kingdom of Prussia waiting to strike in Europe, Napoleon decided not to go to war without the support of Britain. Unfortunately for Napoleon, that support was unlikely, as the leaders of Britain had few reasons to get involved. While Prime Minister Lord Palmerston and other ministers were sympathetic to the Confederacy, the cabinet recognized that it was not economical for them to go to war. British financial institutions were heavily invested in railways and other projects with Union territory, and northern states of the US were some of the chief importers of British and French luxury and manufactured goods. Furthermore, by 1861, 40% of Great Britain's wheat imports came from the Union. France was similarly reliant on Union food imports, and Napoleon III was no doubt wary of having to tell a hungry French populace, let them eat cotton. Both nations did have economic ties to the South, with southern cotton fueling much of the British and French textile industries. Unlike northern grain and trade markets, however, southern cotton could be replaced. Both countries had built up sizable stockpiles by 1861, and when the surplus ran out, subsequent cotton shortages were offset by imports from the British territories of Egypt and India.
So they all benefited from what they were fighting against, so it's sort of easy to see why they wouldn't have got involved, because they were benefiting from it, but then maybe the moral side they didn't agree with, and then obviously you've got two sides you want to side with. You can see why these countries wouldn't have got involved.
Besides economics, diplomacy also played a major role in keeping Europe out of the Civil War. Confederate diplomats were inexperienced and clumsy, chosen by President Davis for personal and political reasons rather than for diplomatic skill. Davis was convinced that all he had to do was dangle the South's great King Cotton before the European powers, who would then eagerly offer their support. The Union, meanwhile, engaged in more skillful and subtle diplomacy, which culminated in the diplomatic masterstroke that was Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. By announcing to the world that the Union was fighting to end the institution of slavery, he effectively made the Civil War a moral conflict. By making this narrative clear, Lincoln ensured that politicians in Europe could not express their support for the Confederacy without being seen as pro-slavery.
Fair enough.
As a result of these economic and diplomatic factors, there was never a serious push within the British government to get the empire involved with the Civil War. The closest...
Quite smart, because I feel like probably in these times a lot of the people in power would have probably sided with the Confederate side, the South at that point. But after Lincoln made it about a certain thing, the general public would see the Prime Minister of that certain country or whatever, and then they'll see their sort of opinions, and then they're going to just want them out straight away, because the general population probably wouldn't have agreed with that. So yeah, it's interesting how it was made like that, but it's just so crazy how we've moved in time so fast. Like, the world was like this, 140, 150 years ago? And now it's just changed so much. It's just wild to me. Imagine in 100 years' time how different it's going to be. It's just so crazy. I can't wrap my head around it. 50 years ago, it's just weird. Like, I've got all these computers. I'm just watching people talking about history from 150 years ago. Imagine what someone was doing in this house. It probably wasn't a house here, but just in this bit of land 150 years ago. It's just so weird. Oh, mate. Bro, it's crazy. I wish you could just find out the answers to everything.
To the empire ever came to intervening was the Trent Affair, when two Confederate diplomats attempting to travel to Europe aboard a British ship were intercepted and seized by the Union Navy. The boarding of a British vessel and the abduction of its passengers infuriated the British public, parliament, and cabinet, and a demand for the prisoners' release and a full apology was immediately sent to Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, thousands of additional troops were dispatched to Canada, and the Royal Navy was placed on high alert. President Lincoln recognized the danger and promptly complied with the British demand, releasing the diplomats and issuing a vague faux apology to satisfy the British.
Faux apology.
Aside from the close call of the Trent Affair, no European nation ever came close to intervening in the American Civil War. Even if the combined might of Britain and France could have changed the course of the war, they were both ultimately deterred from involvement by the skillful diplomacy of the Union and, of course, economic concerns. Although there were factions in Europe that supported the Confederacy, in a rare moment, practical considerations outweighed ideology. In the end, the nations of Europe chose to leave the American Civil War to the Americans.
It is just wild to me how no matter how far in the future we'll go, no matter how far back in history we would go, money like rules all. Your like opinions and your like thoughts will be thrown out the window if you get a bit of money for it. And yeah, it's same here. Like they had opinions, and a lot of it was based on them getting imported things, I guess, for cheaper and stuff. Like it's crazy. But I like how the Prussians are full of Gordon Ramsay's like, congratulations, you guys are fucking terrible at this. Europe doing the American Civil War, I'm the American spectator. Yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this reaction. If you want more stuff like this, let me know in the comments, and until next time, like, subscribe, and peace.